As you can see, you can be opening your Bibles to Esther chapter 9. Just a couple heads up about a couple things. Material for Wednesday night is in the back, and we're going to be looking at the historicity of Jesus. Was Jesus a real person? How do we know that he really existed and did the things that the Bible says that he did? And I'll let you know that that material that's back there has more pages than normal, because I've put all of the most reliable quotes from non-Christian sources from around the time of Jesus and maybe about 200 years later, of people that were not Christians that referenced Christ in their writings to show that those people believed that Jesus was a real person. So there's extra material back there for that class. We're not going to look at all of that on Wednesday, but I want to give that to you partially for reference, but we will talk about some of those specific things on Wednesday night. Sunday nights, we've been looking at the book of Esther. Tonight is going to be the last lesson as we finish this book. It's been the custom since I've been here that on Sunday nights, whenever I preach, that we're going through a book of the Bible. So far since being here, we've done Ephesians, 2 Timothy, Ruth, and now Esther. The plan, Lord willing, next is to go through the book of Romans. It is, in my mind, one of the hardest books of the Bible, and I look forward to studying through those things with all of us together. But for now, we're going to be turning our attention to our final lesson in Esther. What is your pet sin? I'm talking about the sin that you keep coming back to whenever you're afraid or experiencing some kind of discomfort. It's the sin that in order to get some degree of comfort or peace, at least momentarily, you go back to it. When we think about a sin that would be like that, we might think of it automatically in terms of some kind of sexual sin or some kind of a substance that people will use to numb themselves. But I would suggest that we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook that easy if we don't struggle with those kinds of things. That all of us have some kind of struggle that we might go back to whenever we're fearful or discomforted. And maybe it would be the desire to have the praise of men. Maybe it's those little moments where you feel like you can exercise some degree of power or authority over people and you feel good about yourself in those ways. What are the things that you habitually struggle with if you don't fight it? Metaphorically, for us, the nation of Israel, throughout their history since they left Egypt, had a nation that were like a thorn in the side to them, that were like this pet sin kind of idea. The Amalekites, God says this to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 25, verse 19, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, you shall not forget. The Amalekites were the first people who attacked the Israelites after they left Egypt. And they battle these people in Exodus chapter 17. They're victorious over them. And then later God says that you need to blot these people out. And in the book of Esther, we're seeing the culmination of these battles take place. There's a man named Haman that from an earlier lesson we showed how this guy was related to the Amalekites. And there's another man named Mordecai who's connected to King Saul, and King Saul was ordered to have these people destroyed, and he failed to do it. And now, hundreds of years later, in the book of Esther, you've got this final showdown. The Israelites are going to finally put to death this pet sin. They're going to finally put to death these people that had mistreated them and were enemies of God. I'm going to suggest that if you have some kind of a pet sin in your life, something that you keep coming back to again and again, that if you trust in the Lord and rely on His strength, that these things can be killed. And as we study these chapters, we're going to see some lessons that would apply to that sort of thing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start out in Esther chapter 9, verses 1 through 19, where we're going to see this day where the Persians can kill all of the Jews living in Persia. And the Israelites are going to be delivered from this this day that would have been an ominous day. And we start this chapter in verses 1 through 4 with a summary of the victory that they have over their enemies. Look at Esther chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. Mordecai, who used to serve at the king's gate, has now risen to be second in command, as we're going to see at the end of this section that we're looking at tonight. But since Esther chapter 3, there was this date that was set by this wicked man named Haman, the 13th day of the month of Adar, and in the minds of the Jews, this date is a scary date. But Mordecai reverses this, or gives another decree that says that the Jews, when this day rolls around, they can defend themselves, and the whole book has been looking forward to this moment. And you see that in verses 1 through 4, what we just read, that rather than the Persians gaining mastery over the Jews gained mastery over the Persians. It's the exact opposite of what you expected to have happen. Since Esther chapter 4, the tables have begun to reverse. And I think what we're seeing here is that God is helping the people, but the people are also engaged in the activities that they need to be doing. Do you notice in this text that no one could stand before the Israelites? And the reason is because the fear of the Israelites and Mordecai was on them. Throughout this book, God has not been mentioned or named explicitly. But you've seen, as some people have called it, the silent sovereignty of God. God is clearly working in this book, not through miracles, but you see him working through these people and getting to a place where these people can defend themselves and they're going to be delivered in this text. But this language of nobody could stand before the Israelites or the Jews should remind you of the book of Joshua. In Joshua 21, verse 44, and the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of their enemies had withstood them. Nobody could stand against the Jews here. Nobody could withstand the Jews in the book of Joshua. How often do we see in the Bible that people are doing the things that God asked them to do, and those people don't take credit for themselves for the success, but they give it to the Lord? You remember when Jesus asked the disciples, how many loaves and fish do you have? And they had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then he says, I'll take that, and then he multiplies it for the 5,000. You had man giving what they had to God, and then God multiplied that and did something with it. In this text, you even have all the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors and the royal agents helping the Jews. What did that look like? Other Persian people siding with the Jews and defending these people. I think one thing that we need to learn from this is that we get an application of divine help plus human activity. This is one of those conundrums that Bible students have debated and thought about for years and years. How can we have God helping us, but we still have to do something? And if we have to do something, does that mean that we get the credit or God gets the credit? Let me think about maybe one way to illustrate this, and this illustration is going to be a really bad one, but it might help us kind of understand what's going on. Have you ever heard people praise Dave Ramsey? Dave Ramsey helped me get out of debt, and Dave Ramsey taught me how to cut up my credit card and not cry about it. And Dave Ramsey this and Dave... Well, you had to submit to the wisdom of Dave Ramsey, but yet you're giving credit to Dave Ramsey, and the reason is because you never would have thought of the ideas that he gave to you. Now, I think there's more at work than just God simply giving us some advice and some wisdom, although that's not always just a simple thing. But think about how the Bible teaches us to pray every day that God would give us our daily bread. Does that mean that I don't have to go to work? Or how God has asked us to reach the lost around us. But that means that we're using His words, the scriptures that He's revealed, and that He's the one working with us, and we're the one watering and planting, but He's the one giving the increase. Or, going back to this idea of a pet sin, we're supposed to cut off our right hand if it causes us to sin. And that's what the instruction is that would help us overcome this and have delivery from that thing that keeps messing up our lives, and we're planning our schedule around it. We have to do what Jesus has said, but He's the one that gets the credit because it's His ideas and He's the one helping. And somehow those ideas come together, and we see it coming together in the book of Esther. Now, these first 4 verses just give us a summary. That the Jews gained mastery over these people. What are some of the details to what's happening? Look at verses 5 through 16 of Esther chapter 9. Esther chapter 9, verses 5 through 16. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshadantha, and Delphin, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adalia, and Aridatha, and Parma. These are all the sons of Haman, and this is a difficult one. And verse 9, and Parmashta, and Arasai, and Aradai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. That very day, the number of those who were killed in Susa the citadel were reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Try to imagine what's happening here. This day rolls around, the Jews can arm themselves, and the Persians who want to destroy them are armed and ready, and they've been sharpening their swords and reloading all their ammunition for this day. And so finally this day comes, and in Susa, the winter capital, this is the emphasis of this text, there are 500 Persians that decided, even though this edict has been reversed, or there was an edict that gives the opposing ideas to what Haman ever said, 500 men wake up that morning, or maybe they stay up all night, and have aligned themselves with Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and they have plotted and tried to figure out, how can we kill as many of these people as we can? And the Jews destroy those 500 people and the 10 sons of Haman, who have really hard names to pronounce. And as Xerxes is talking to his wife, and they're talking about all the success that's happening in the nation at this moment, he says, well, wow, you guys are really doing a great job. What further requests do you have, Esther? And what Esther says next is one of those things that has troubled people a lot, because she requests an extra day just for the capital to be able to kill more Persians the next day. Why would she do that? I mean, doesn't this seem kind of vindictive that Esther would say to her husband, I want another day for our people to go ahead and kill more people, and I want the 10 sons of Haman all impaled on poles so everybody can see that these guys were killed? Would there be possibly a good reason for her to request something like that? And I think so. I like what one person has said about it. Esther may be addressing a danger not previously revealed. That she is concerned only with Susa, however, suggests she is responding to a specific information about the city. She could hardly know about the rest of the empire, and therefore makes no comment on it. The exposure of the corpses of Haman's sons would be a powerful signal to those who continued to oppose the Jews, pointing to the king's support for them. This seems reasonable. Perhaps she's gotten information that, even though 500 of the Persians have been killed, that there's more people that want to gather the next day, and they kill 300 more people, that King Xerxes permits this because there is a good reason for these people to finally be put to their end, and the Israelites, the Jewish people, are finally taking the Amalekites, and they're done. And so she must have had information that warranted a second day for this. In verse 16, we don't get all the stories, but you can imagine that there would be lots of stories. 75,000 Persians who sought to lay hands on the Jews all around the empire, also destroyed. Can you imagine all the stories of heroism from those? But we don't get any details, really, because this text is emphasizing Susa. Did you notice in this text that we read, there's a phrase repeated 3 times? They took no plunder. You see it in verse 10. You see it in verse 15, you see it in verse 16, that even though the edict in the previous chapter that Mordecai wrote said that they could plunder these people didn't take any plunder at all. Why do you think the Jews would have taken no plunder from these enemies? I can think of a couple reasons. One reason would be that the reason that they're killing these people is not at all any other reason than self-defense. This is not self-enrichment. This is not an opportunity for them to get more money in their coffers. This is really that their life was in danger and they were engaging in self-defense. Maybe that's the reason. But do you remember what King Saul, who was told to destroy the Amalekites, do you remember what it was that he was told to do but he didn't do? In 1 Samuel 15, verses 2 and 3, thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. And do you remember what Saul does? Well, we spared the best, and we left King Agag alive, and then Samuel has to come and say, why do I hear the bleating of the sheep? Why is Agag still alive? We have to wipe all of these people out. That's what Deuteronomy said, and you haven't done that, and now it seems like these Jews know the law and know what's expected. This enemy is got to be completely eradicated. Now, you ask yourself this question. For that pet sin that you struggle with, do you sort of like to lock it up, but know where the key is? And you maybe you want to keep like the most enjoyable moments you've had with that sin and keep them as cherished moments, things that you can continue to meditate on. Look at what these people are doing. It's done. We're ashamed of it. It's not anything that we're proud of. We want these people gone because this is what God has asked of us. What is it in the book of Judges that happens when they don't fully eliminate all of the people living in Canaan? They become like thorns in their sides. If you've not drawn a line in the sand and said, with this sin, this thing that I keep struggling with, I'm going to be more conscious about getting it out of my life, then it's just going to be a thorn in your side, and you're going to kind of be happy from time to time when you can indulge in it. You realize that for God to be giving them the victory, goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, when God tells Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever dishonors you, I will curse. Have you ever tracked that promise in Genesis 12:3 throughout the rest of the Old Testament? That every nation that blesses Israel is blessed, and every nation that dishonors Israel is cursed. Now, that verse has become a verse that a lot of people are wondering about today for the Israel conflicts and stuff. I don't think that promise has anything to do with the literal nation of Israel today. But what the New Testament does teach is that one day, for every Christian that's been afflicted, because we are the real Israel, we're the true Israel, every one of you who's ever been afflicted by an enemy, every one of you who's ever been persecuted, what does that 2 Thessalonians 1:6 say? God considers it just to repay with affliction those who afflict you. There's coming a day where all the persecutors, all the opponents of you, all the people that scoffed at our faith, they will be judged one day. And these people are given victory. And it's not for self-enrichment. Notice what happens at the end of this section in verses 17 through 19. Esther chapter 9, verses 17 through 19. And this was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made a day for feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that day a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold a 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and also as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. 2 days of feasting and gladness. The more rural areas have 1 day of it, and the people that lived in the city had another day, perhaps because of how the battles took place in other parts of the empire, something like that. But the point is that they got relief from their enemies. They have rest now. How is it that they got relief and rest? It was through fighting. The Bible teaches that if you want to have peace and relief, if you're not willing to fight, you're never going to understand true rest. Think about your pet sin again. When was the last time you really wrestled with it? When was the last time you had that temptation to do that thing or think that way or engage in that activity or take that substance, and you knew that it was going to give you momentary pleasure, but you refused to do it, experiencing momentary pain, but in the long run, lasting joy? If you don't fight, there is no rest. There is no relief. You want to know what the most addictive emotion is? According to psychologists, if they know what they're talking about, is anger. You know how good it feels sometimes to just get real angry and yell at somebody? When was the last time you made conscious effort to fight it and have that moment where you could say those things that would feel so good to say, and you decide that I'm going to put that to death, and then you actually understand what it means to get relief or to have rest and to be glad that the Lord's given you victory? These people are fully putting sin to death here, metaphorically. If they have been delivered, they're going to memorialize it. And in verses 20 to 32, the rest of this chapter, it's going to be memorialized by an edict or by a letter written by both Mordecai and then a second letter by Esther, kind of fulfilling the Jewish idea of 2 or 3 witnesses confirming something. Look at the first one with Mordecai's letter in verses 20 through 28. Esther chapter 9, verses 20 through 28. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned from them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days of sending gifts to food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in the letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that the days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease from among their descendants. All right, do you see how much this text emphasized that this has become an annual feast that the Jews are expected to engage in? It's the only feast that the Old Testament talks about that's not in the law of Moses, that they're going to do year by year, and they're never told to stop doing it, that sort of thing. It's remembered throughout every generation. By the way, even today, Jews still keep the day of Purim and pure Purim comes from the term casting lots, because the lots are what Haman did in chapter 3 to have the date set to kill them. So they name it after that. But one of the things that the Jews still do today that keep this is they read the book of Esther out loud, and there's kids that have a noise machine called a grogger, and it's like a piece of wood that you spin, and it's got this thing that makes a really loud sound. I remember when we were in California, I got a grogger for Asher, and then he would run around, and it was so loud that I think I threw it away. I don't know where it went anymore. But you can look up some of the things that they do today still. But in verse 27, do you see that it's not just for the Jews proper, but it's anybody who's joined them, anybody that's converted. Sounds a lot like what the Passover was, but it's like a new kind of Passover. Now, I want to draw one main thing from what this letter is suggesting. This day of feasting and gladness, and they're sending gifts to one another of food, and they're all remembering what it is that God had done for them. This is couched in the context of something so vile and sinister that was planned against them. They're supposed to remember that Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. Do you want to know one of the reasons why we sometimes struggle with joy? Is because we don't remember the darkness. You cannot go to the heights of joy unless you understand from where you've come. And these feasts, like the Passover or like Purim here, they're remembering we were all going to die, or we were enslaved in Egypt, and God delivered us from that. So part of the thing that's going to elicit joy from their hearts is, I got to remember where I came from. We got to remember what the danger was. And we just got to ask ourselves, how much do you remember where you've come from? We're commanded to. Ephesians 2:12, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, having no hope and without God in the world. How do you know if you have a good memory? Is it if you can quote book, chapter, and verse? And you can remember facts and information? And yeah, that's pretty cool if you can do that, but your age is probably going to take that away eventually. You want to know how you know if you have a good memory biblically? Is if you never forget where you came from. You never forget that because of the things I did, I deserved to go to hell. I was going to be defeated by something far worse than the Persians and the Amalekites. Look at this passage in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. In the context, Peter's talking about all these qualities that we're supposed to grow in: brotherly love, affection, faith, all these things that we're supposed to add to our faith. It says in this passage, for whoever lacks these qualities is so nearsighted that he is blind, having forgotten that he was cleansed from his former sins. You know what Peter is saying here? One of the ways that you know that you've forgotten that you were cleansed from your former sins is if you've stopped growing. If you've stopped having joy in the Lord, that's fueled your strength to grow in the areas that he's asked you to grow. Just, maybe it's not good to, look at what this is saying. Have you forgotten that you were cleansed from your former sins? For a moment, think about the deepest, darkest things you've done that you don't want anybody else here to know. You got it? You realize that you've been cleansed if you're in the Lord? And these are things, by the way, that we better be ashamed of. These aren't, have you ever heard people talk about their past sins and, oh, I used to do this and I used to do that, almost like they're kind of proud of it? You better be ashamed of it. You better realize that it was because of those things you had no hope and you didn't have God, and when God saved you, it wasn't like God was doing a little tune-up. He was taking somebody who was dead and he brought them back to life. Is it hard to remember some of that, or do you want to start taking some of the credit for your growth? If you want to have joy and gladness, you have to remember the darkness, and you've got to remember how God has enlightened you. This letter from Mordecai is letting everybody know it was really bad, and then we were rescued. Do you remember that in your own life? Now, this gets confirmed by Esther's letter. Look at verses 29 to 32. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them. And as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast and their lamenting, the command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Do you see something very ironic that's happening here? Do you remember the beginning of the book, the first edict that's written in the book? Oh no, women might take control of everything because Vashti rightly disobeyed her husband. And then at the end of the book, who's somebody that clearly has a lot of authority? Is Esther. And she's sending this letter out by the authority of Mordecai and Queen Esther, and they've obligated the people to remember this feast. All right, one of the things that I've heard from some of you as we've been looking through the book of Esther is several of you have come up to me and said, "You've ruined the book of Esther." And what they've meant by that is there's always been like this Disney version of Esther that's been presented. That there's no sex trafficking in the book. Esther's not sleeping with a pagan king before she's married to him. And clearly in Esther chapter 2, there is sex trafficking happening for the king. And he is sleeping with all these women before he marries them, including Esther. And that makes really challenging. How do I teach this to the kids now? Because that's pretty clearly what's happening in the text. And some of you have kind of wondered, have these sermons taken away something from your understanding of the book of Esther? Let me suggest something here. Esther is way more relatable than the Disney version that has been oftentimes thought of. Esther is sinning at the beginning of the book. She's succumbing to peer pressure. She's also the victim of very difficult circumstances, and I don't want to take away from that whatsoever. But you do compare her to, say, Daniel in exile, and they're willing to stand up before the king. I understand she's a woman, and in societies like that especially, there's more peer pressure to cave, but she's still caving, and she's hiding her Jewish identity. Have you ever felt like that? Where you caved to peer pressure, you kind of hid your identity as a Christian? Doesn't it suddenly seem like Esther might be a little bit more relatable? And then finally at the end of the book, do you see that her position as queen is interrelated with her being a Jew? She's not afraid of who she is now. What we're seeing in the book of Esther is the growth of a woman. And that, I think, is a lot more relatable than a book where a woman or anybody is just perfect from the beginning, if it's not Jesus. Here, she has gone from darkness to a place of prominence. She's gone to a place of trusting more and more in the Lord, it seems, as we've looked at this book, where she's writing this letter at the end saying, we got to remember what it is that the Lord has done, but the Lord's not explicitly mentioned, but that's what Purim's all about. You know the times in your life that you've grown the most? If you've been steadfast in doing the right thing, is when things were dark. You can look back to a few months back when you weren't doing the things that you shouldn't have done, and then God put you through a pressure cooker, and you cared about doing the right things, and your character grew, and you ended up being able to look back and say, thank God I had deliverance over that situation or that sin, and now I'm not the same person, and that's what we're seeing in this book. If God has given you deliverance, don't ever forget it. They're memorializing the deliverance that God has given them. But we end this with one of the shortest chapters in the Bible, in Esther chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. This final 3 verses is like, this is what the normal days were like after this deliverance that the Jews had. The king's doing his tax business. Government's got to do that sort of thing. Kind of feels like back to normal. But what happens with Mordecai is he joins the ranks of people like Joseph, Daniel, Nehemiah, Jewish people who rose to great heights in pagan nations. But you notice also that this guy was popular with his brothers. You want to know the secret to being popular with your brothers? What was it that made this guy popular with his brothers? There's two things said about it. He sought their welfare. Here's a guy that's second in command, and he's really interested in them doing well. That's very different than acting like you're interested in other people doing well, so you can feel like those people appreciate you, which is just a manipulation tactic. He really cared that they were doing well. He wasn't using them for praise. He wasn't using them for honor. He really cared about them. And by the way, this idea of he sought their welfare wasn't just that one time when the Persians were going to kill us. He doesn't just kick back the rest of his career and go, I saved them all that one time and I'm going to ride on the coattails of that victory. This is something that he continually didn't give up. He also spoke peace to them. Well, I already gave y'all peace one time when we had that edict that reversed everything and you guys could go defend yourselves. Why should I continue to speak peace to you? Because this man has grown too throughout this book. He's not a perfect guy at the beginning of the book. But look at what he does with his leadership. How many leaders throughout history really seek the welfare of those under them and really speak peace to them? Here's a guy who does that, and you can understand why he's really admired. But as great as it might have been to be a Jew in those days, we live in better days than that. There's a prophecy of Jesus that says this in Isaiah 9, verse 6, For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Jesus sought our welfare and still seeks our welfare. Jesus is the one that speaks words of peace to us, that if we do the things that he has said, we can put to death those pet sins. We can be people that God has asked us to be and understand a peace that surpasses understanding. I'm struck, as we put this series to a close, with a passage in Isaiah 49, verse 16 that describes God's love. Can a woman forget her nursing child? And the answer to that is no. That she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. God is saying here, there are extreme times. We would all say normally a woman can't forget her nursing child, but there are extreme situations where they might. But God, he'll never, ever forget you. What we've been seeing in the book of Esther is a group of people that have been exiled, people that have sinned against God, and God has compassion on them. God uses this silent sovereignty. He uses his hand to help them in this situation where now they've been delivered and they can memorialize what he's done. What have you been delivered from? What can you memorialize in your heart right now about the things that God has helped you put to death? Praise be to God that we serve a Lord that sent his Son and taught us how to put these things to death. It doesn't mean that we're always going to be perfect. We've seen this in the book of Esther. We've seen the growth of character. In what ways have you grown in the last year? In what ways have you grown in the last 6 months? You have divine help coupled with man's submission to what God has said, and that creates deliverance and victory. We're about to sing a song, Is Thy Heart Right with God? Is your heart right with God? Is it in tune with the things that God expects of you and has commanded you? If not, this is an opportunity to get your heart right with God. Either the option is available to come forward when we stand and sing or to talk to somebody before you leave. But if there's anything we can do, do not leave here. If you were to die in a car accident tonight and your heart wasn't right with God, think about where you'd be. Are you right with God? Is there anything that we can do for you tonight? Please come forward while we stand, while we sing.